Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And I'm excited to be here with you today and very excited to present our next speaker, Dr. Sukhbinder Kumar. Dr. Kumar is Research Assistant Professor of Neurosurgery at the University of Iowa. And Dr. Kumar will be speaking to us today about some of his recent work on mimicry in misophonia. So with that, I will go ahead and give it over to Dr. Kumar.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Now we can see it.
Okay, fine. Yeah, so the topic of my presentation today is mimicry in misophonia. So this is from the very recent paper that has been accepted for publication. So mimicking, in a very simplistic way, we can define as the repetition of the action of the trigger person in response to trigger sound. So, for example, in response to the eating sound, you just kind of start moving your mouth in the same way as if, for example, you were making those sounds. Mimicking can be spontaneous. That is, it can occur without you being aware of it, without you having any control over it, or it can also be done deliberately. Now, interestingly, if you look at the literature in misophonia, you find that there are some reports of mimicry being reported. So, for example, there was a study in 2008 where they reported the case of a single subject who had the urge to mimic in response to trigger sound. And there were also like another study where 6 out of 11 people, for example, reported that they kind of they have an urge to mimic the sounds from the trigger person. But there hasn't been any systematic evaluation of the prevalence of mimicry and why people do mimicry and then so on. So what we did is we collected self-reported tendency to mimic. So we gave them a questionnaire and measured their self-reported tendency to mimic from a large sample using questionnaire. So we asked the following questions. Is there any systematic relationship between the severity of misophonia and the likelihood of mimicking, whether you mimic more depending upon how severe your misophonia is? And does the act of mimicking relate to any specific type of triggers? And then what is the effect of mimicking? Why do you do mimicking? So we collected data from more than 650 participants to evaluate its prevalence. We asked like simple questions. What is your misophonia severity? What are the types of triggers you have, whether you mimic or not? And does the act of mimicking provide you any relief, for example, whether you do it deliberately or you do it spontaneously, or whether it's very spontaneous without under control. So this is just the data. If you just divide the data into categories of misophonia severity, so for example, no misophonia, and then you have the severe misophonia, and you can see, and this is the percentage of people who said yes, they mimic on the y-axis. So you can see that as the misophonia severity increases, the likelihood of people saying that they mimic increases. This is a more systematic statistical analysis using logistic regression, where we have the misophonia severity on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the likelihood of mimicking. 1 means very certain, 0 means you are not mimicking at all. So you can see that statistical analysis also confirmed that there is a increase in the tendency to mimic as the misophonia severity increases. Then we also asked them, okay, what are the different type of triggers we have? And so we measure a quantity called odds ratio. So the odds ratio, you can simply think of whether, for example, when you do a regression analysis, whether there's systematic relationship between the type of triggers you have and the misophonia severity. So we put all the different types of sound, different types of triggers together and evaluate their systematic relationship to the misophonia severity. So you have all the different types of triggers all the participants in the study kind of indicated what type of triggers they have. And we found that only the eating sound was highly significant in predicting your misophonia severity. So the eating, and we also got like a significant but much lower significance compared to the eating sound for the consonant on the vowel sound also. But no other trigger sound other than the eating sound and the consonant and vowel sound kind of make any significant contribution to the mimicry. So the why is it that people mimicking? That response was a bit of a mixed one. So I'll just show you the response to the, so the question was, the act of mimicking is spontaneous and out of my control. And these are the different the percentage of people who mimic. They said, okay, it was never, never or always. And the act of mimicking is under my control and I just do it deliberately. You can see that numbers is kind of like rising here and it's kind of falling on this side, meaning that people at least who are saying that they mimic, they say that okay, they just do it deliberately rather than being completely out of their control. And the effect of mimicry, so the question was, mimicking the action sound of the trigger person provides me relief from the distress. So again, scale going from never to always. And so here was the that okay, this when I mimic the action or the sound of the trigger person, it makes me feel under control. Again, it's a bit of a kind of like a mixed response, but you can see that at least there is some sort of benefit in a way that okay, when they trigger, either it provides some sort of relief to them or it makes them feel under control of the situation. So overall, we found that if you just take the people who mimic versus people who do not mimic, about half of the total participants, about 46.7% of the participants reported mimicking behavior. And as I showed that the likelihood of mimicking increases with the misophonia severity also. And mimicking was elicited strongly by eating sounds. But here there could be because if you look at the population of the triggers that we had, there was a dominant number of participants who reported eating sounds as their triggers. So it could be a sampling issue that, okay, maybe we could have other population where there are different types of triggers. But at least within this population, we found that the mimicking was strongly elicited by the eating sounds. And mimicking was deliberate in a larger proportion of participants. And either it provides relief from the distress and or make them feel under control of the situation. Now, what could it mean? So, as you probably know, we have been arguing that misophonia goes beyond the sound-driven case, that misophonia is much more than the sound-caused distress, and there's a social angle to it. But I'll not probably go into the detail of that model, but simply, one thing that needs to be clear is that the mimicry is very common in the social world. So even, for example, this is completely outside the misophonia domain. In a social world, we most commonly mimic the action and behaviors of others. And sometimes we may not be even aware of it, that we are maybe moving our hands and moving our legs. For example, when we are communicating with each other, we have gestures which are kind of synchronized with other. We move our hands and mouth and all those synchronized activities happening. So the mimicking is very, very common in the social world. And interestingly, it has been very well studied in social psychology. Why do people mimic? What sort of tendencies drive this mimicry behavior and so on. So that question has been studied in the social psychology for quite some time. So the question is this mimicry in misophonia the same as the mimicry in the social world? We don't know at the moment whether it is the same thing or it's a different one. But as you know, in the social world, people say, oh, you tend to mimic the other person to whom you feel more closer. So you are more closely associated, or you have a more affiliative relationship with the other group or the people you can tend to mimic more in response to that one. Now, whether that kind of really can translate back to the misophonia is uncertain. We don't know about that one. So it might happen that the mechanism could be similar, mechanism of the general prevalence of mimicry in the social world versus the mimicry in the misophonia. The mechanism could be very similar. The underlying brain mechanism could be very similar. The underlying psychological processes could also be similar. But obviously, their objective could be different. So we need to make a distinction between the mechanism per se and the objective why mimicking is done. For example, as I said, social mimicry in a social world is kind of more for affiliation and so on, which could be very difficult to translate within the misophonia one. So one thing that we have been arguing in our work is that prevalence of mimicry at least points to the social aspect of misophonia. I find it very hard to explain if I have to restrict myself within the sound domain and whether I can explain mimicry within that domain. And I think the social aspect can explain it much better compared to just restricting whether misophonia being only a sound-driven disorder or distress. And that merely considering a disorder of sound perception may not be sufficient. So probably we need to extend misophonia beyond that. There are limitations of our work, which main thing is that it's a self-reported data, and that any self-reported data has some bias associated with it. So we need to maybe correct this bias, and so we need. And the other thing is that self-report also requires that the subject should be aware of their mimicry. So as I said, mimicry can happen even outside of your awareness. So those people may not be able to report mimicry because they are not even aware of it. So these are the limitations that probably we should be correcting in future work. And what we need is a more objective measurement of mimicry in the lab setting, for example. And that's what actually our current direction is, where we plan to measure mimicry in the lab using called electromyography, where you can attach some electrodes around the facial muscles, and you can record the mimicry. Maybe in response you can play a trigger sound or a non-trigger sound, and you can have a mesophonic participant versus non-mesophonic, or people who mimic versus people who do not mimic, and you can record the activity of the muscles. And this is a work. Almost work has been done for more than 50 years in the emotional literature, where people measure your emotional responses, your facial emotional responses. So this work can be directly translated to the mimicry one, where we can objectively measure. And even if they may not be aware of it, but their muscle could still be twitching in response to the trigger or non-trigger sound. So we can have a systematic characterization of the mimicry in misophonia. So this work is in progress, and probably we'll have something to say maybe in the next presentation. So what I also want to say is that the more general aspect, I probably will not have time to explain the whole model of misophonia that we have been proposing, but all of that is there so the initial version of this one was proposed in our 2021 paper, the motor basis of misophonia, where we argued that misophonia goes beyond auditory perception, and we showed some motor activation in response to that one. And this is the mimicry paper that that I showed you the data that is just published. And we have another kind of a more theoretical or more of a philosophical argument about the social basis of misophonia has also been accepted for publication in the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society. And we have argued that there is a need to go beyond the sound model of the misophonia. Last but not least, I would like to thank all my colleagues who have been very helpful. Paris, who did the data analysis, Dr. Phillip Gander, Dr. Joe Berger, they have been very helpful in helping with the data analysis and putting the theoretical perspective, and Dr. Ester Benzaque from Newcastle University, who was also involved in the data collection and analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar, to you and to your team. So there have been many questions that have come in and comments as well. So I want to start just by pointing out kind of a diversity of comments that are coming in terms of individuals saying that they are either aware of the mimicking that they're engaging in or not aware, or that, they find it to be a negative thing in terms of them, engaging in mimicking, or for others, it's a coping mechanism. So given that, this range of thoughts towards mimicking, there's a question on how clinicians might utilize this knowledge and utilize mimicry in their own work with clients.
Yeah, no, I think it's a question that has been asked to me quite from a number of even misophonia. It's kind of like, as I said, I may not be a kind of suitable person to advise to the clinicians, but I think in a way, it seems like the data is confirming, and then I think with the EMG recording, probably we'll have more confirmation about the prevalence of mimicry and why people do that. So it seems like, and we have also argued in our theoretical paper why it could provide a relief. So I'll just repeat in a simple way. So when, for example, you're mimicking in response to the action of others. So when you see somebody eating, just by seeing that person, your motor cortex in the brain is activated as if you were doing the eating. And that kind of activates your mouth muscles and so on. So one of the things that we're saying that we are arguing is that, okay, that kind of gives you a lot of, it starts interfering in your day-to-day, whatever you are working, for example, because your motor cortex is saying, okay, activate your mouth muscle, do the action what the other person is doing. It's kind of like forcing you to do the action. But when you do the mimicking, when you voluntarily do it, it kind of provides you self-control, that, okay, you have some control over it. So you feel, that's why a lot of people seem to say, oh yeah, we need relief, but we also feel a sense of control that, okay, we can control it. So that's the kind of theoretical argument. So if you want to extend this theoretical argument to the practical application, in a way, yes, maybe repeating the action will provide you some sort of self-control. But the thing is, in a way, in which way we should do it, I mean, that can probably vary from person to person. But it seems like when you try to repeat those actions yourself, that can provide you some sort of, synchronizing that one or doing that action can provide you some relief based on that theoretical argument that we are putting. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you. All right, there's another question regarding what triggering looks like. So a child is triggered by people chewing and will sometimes respond to a trigger by aggressively grabbing or squeezing his own cheeks. And would you consider this to be mimicking, or, what does mimicking most often look like?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we have looked at only a very limited aspect of mimicking, which is only with the eating and, chewing sound. So only in adults so far. So now whether the mimicking phenomena does extend to other types of triggers, and one of my colleagues, Dr. Phillip Gander, will be looking at that also. For example, whether we see similar like motor activation and whether it is similarly prevalent in other type of triggers. So I think now and as the question kind of points out, what do you call mimicry? Because mimicking is just kind of completely just replicating the action, or maybe, or you have an intent to do that action, or maybe you do that action in a different way. And I think that's a very gray area, like which part, whether you just have to do the action in exactly the same way, you need to synchronize with the other person, or you can do that action in slightly different way. I think those are the questions that we need addressing. As I said, this is all a self-reported data, and what exactly will qualify as mimicking, whether the action or the completely repeating that needs to be further investigated.
Right. So there's a lot left to learn, even though this has made a great start. Okay, another comment and question. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Can you share your thoughts about how parents and loved ones can respond or communicate best in response to mimicry when they see it in their family member or loved one?
Yeah, so I think if you see mimicry, so if I understand the question, are they saying, okay, if they see the mimicking is happen, whether they should encourage or discourage? Is that the issue?
Right. How should they encourage it maybe, or should they, is there any type of response that the parent or loved one can give the person that they know that they see mimicking once they see it?
I think, as I said, based on our data, I would say definitely, at least we haven't actually come across anybody saying, oh, I do mimicking, but I get a negative, I get more negative, I feel more negative. I mean, as I said, the data seems to think that at least, people feel positive and people have some sort of relief from that one. Yeah.
Okay, another question is, can you comment on the role of the mirror neurons and empathy and the connection to mimicry? So intentional or non-intentional, aware or not aware?
Yeah, I think, as I said, this is what we argued in our 2021 paper, what could be the possible mechanism. So those who don't know, I mean, there is a mirroring mechanism. In all of us, we have mirroring mechanism. So as I said, we mirror the actions of the other people. So when I watch somebody doing some action, when I watch somebody just lifting a glass of water, and when I just simply watch it, or even if I'm not watching it, but if I even hear the sound of that action. So somehow that sound that I hear, or I just watch that action, it not only just activate my sound part of the brain or the visual part of the brain, but it also activates part of the motor cortex, which is involved in doing my action. The same part of the motor cortex, which the person that I'm seeing would be using in doing that action. So it seems like there's an automatic activation going on. And that is what we call mirroring. And then if you look at the work in animals, so they have found neurons, for example, in monkey. So when a monkey does the action by himself, the same neuron is active. And when the monkey just watches that action being done by the other person, the same action, the same neuron is also active in that. So either by doing the action or by simply watching the action, the same neuron is active, and those neurons were called as mirror neurons. Now, in animals, we know the mirror neurons are very well known. There's a lot of literature on that one. And obviously, it requires recording at the single neuron level. In humans, the evidence is sparse. One of the things being that, we can't record, in routinely from single neuron in human. So we can rely on some method like fMRI or other methods, but they don't just tell us at the what's going on at the single neuron level. So, but we know that mirroring, there's a mirroring system in humans. There's a mirroring system. System means there's a part of the brain that is involved in mirroring. Now, whether there are mirror neurons or not, that's a different, we don't have that evidence. But mirroring does happen in humans. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yes. And I think it's interesting to see the parallels, but there's still things that we cannot necessarily study at that level in terms of humans versus animals. Okay. Another question. I sometimes mimic as a response to misokinesia triggers. Is there yet any research or literature or resources on mimicry in not just misophonia, but also misokinesia?
We're at 3 minutes, by the way.
Yeah, so the misokinesia, I think specifically with respect to mimicking, at least I'm not aware of that. But I think, so one of the things that we argued in one of our 2021 paper, if you look at the discussion part, is that all of this misokinesia, misophonia, and maybe other trigger types, in some way, we can integrate all of them together and come out with like a simple mechanism, like misokinesia. Okay, again, for example, when you are triggered by somebody just shaking, somebody's shaking leg, right? So you can imagine just by watching that action, your motor cortex, which is involved in shaking your leg, would be automatically driven by that. And when you start doing the action, obviously you get a control over that one. So it's a very same mechanism, which I'm arguing for misophonia. The same mechanism completely extends to the misokinesia. And here is like a integrated framework where misokinesia and misophonia can be put together with the same common mechanism. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. So there is a question about, are children more likely to mimic than adults? Do we have any knowledge about the difference in that type of population or other populations?
So it is true that mirroring does take time. I mean, if you look at the developmental, if I'm aware of the literature, it takes, I think, maybe 2 years of, I mean, it's not there in the adult, and it kind of takes some learning for the mirroring to happen. I mean, there is also argument from the other one that, okay, you have some genetic basis to the mirroring. But I think there's another school of thought that, okay, it's all involves your learning. And I think there is some evidence that mirroring system, which is also good news for misophonia, is that it's not like a fixed one. You can train it. You can train it. So if, for example, you are triggered by some sound, you can associate that sound with some different action. So that association can be built. So it is a flexible system. Whether it is there more in children, I probably can't say in more detail, but it involves a learning trajectory over a period of time. Yeah.
Well, there's still more questions and comments coming in, but unfortunately we have to draw to a close right now. Really want to thank you again, Dr. Kumar, for this really great session, very informative, and looking forward to seeing your next paper come out that was recently accepted.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.